Chapter 18. Islam followed right behind, hardly a year later. I was 15 years old, and I was exploring my hometown. The Muslim quarter wasn't far from the zoo, a small, quiet neighborhood with Arabic writing and crescent moons inscribed on the facades of the houses. I came to Mullah Street. I had a peek at the Jamia Masjid, the great mosque, being careful to stay on the outside, of course. Islam had a reputation that was worse than Christianity's. Fewer gods, greater violence, and I had never heard anyone say any good things about Muslim schools. So I wasn't about to step in, empty though the place was. The building, clean and white except for various edges painted green, was an open construction unfolding around an empty central room. Long straw mats covered the floor everywhere. About above, two slim, fluttered minarets rose in the air before a background of soaring coconut trees. There was nothing evidently religious, or for that matter interesting about the place, but it was pleasant and quiet. I moved on. Just beyond the mosque was a series of attached, single-story dwellings with small, shaded porches. They were run down and poor, their stucco walls a faded green. One of the dwellings was a small shop. I noticed a rack of dusty bottles of Thumbs Up and 4 transparent plastic jars half full of candies. But the main ware was something else, something flat, roundish, and white. I got close. It seemed to be some sort of unleavened bread. I poked at one. It flipped up stiffly. They looked like 3-day-old naans. Who would eat these, I wondered. I picked one up and wagged it to see if it would break. A voice said, "Would you like to taste one?" I nearly jumped out of my skin. It's happened to all of us. There's sunlight and shade, spots and patterns of color. Your mind is elsewhere, so you don't make out what's right in front of you. Not 4 feet away, sitting cross-legged before his breads, was a man. I was so startled my hands flew up and the bread went sailing halfway across the street. It landed on a pat of fresh cow dung. "I'm so sorry, sir. I didn't see you," I burst out. I was just about ready to run away. "Don't worry," he said calmly. "It will feed a cow. Have another one." He tore one in 2. We ate it together. It was tough and rubbery, real work for the teeth, but filling. I calmed down. "So you make these?" I said, to make conversation. "Yes." "Here, let me show you how." He got off his platform and waved me into his house. It was a 2-room hovel. The larger room, dominated by an oven, was the bakery, and the other, separated by a flimsy curtain, was his bedroom. The bottom of the oven was covered with smooth pebbles. He was explaining to me how the bread baked on these heated pebbles when the nasal call of the muezzin wafted through the air of the mosque. I knew it was the call to prayer, but I didn't know what it entailed. I imagined it beckoned the Muslim faithful to the mosque, much like bells summoned us Christians to church. Not so. The banker interrupted himself mid-sentence and said, "Excuse me?" He ducked into the next room for a minute and returned with a rolled-up carpet, which he unfurled on the floor of his bakery, throwing up a small storm of flour. And right there before me, in the midst of his workplace, he prayed. It was incongruous, but it was I who felt out of place. Luckily, he prayed with his eyes closed. He stood straight. He muttered in Arabic. He brought his hands next to his ears, thumbs touching the lobes, looking as if he were straining to hear Allah replying. He bent forward. He stood straight again. He fell to his knees and brought his hands and forehead to the floor. He sat up. He fell forward again. He stood. He started the whole thing again. Why, Islam is nothing but an easy sort of exercise, I thought. Hot weather yoga for the Bedouins. Asanas without sweat, heaven without strain. He went through the cycle 4 times, muttering throughout. When he had finished, with a right-left turning of his head and a short bout of meditation, he opened his eyes, smiled, stepped off the carpet, and rolled it up with a flick of the hand that spoke of old habit. He returned it to the spot in the next room. He came back to me. "What was I saying?" he asked. So it went the first time I saw a Muslim pray. Quick, necessary, physical, muttered, striking. Next time I was praying in church, on my knees, immobile, silent before Christ on the cross. The image of this calisthenic communion with God in the middle of bags of flour kept coming to my mind. Chapter 19. I went to see him again. "What's your religion about?" I asked. His eyes lit up. "It is about the beloved," he replied. I challenge anyone to understand Islam, its spirit, and not to love it. It is a beautiful religion of brotherhood and devotion. The mosque was truly an open construction, to God and to breeze. We sat cross-legged, listening to the imam until the time came to pray. Then the random pattern of sitters disappeared as we stood and arranged ourselves shoulder to shoulder in rows, every base ahead being filled by someone from behind until every line was solid and we were row after row of worshippers. It felt good to bring my forehead to the ground. Immediately it felt like a deeply religious contact. Chapter 20. He was a Sufi, a Muslim mystic. He sought fana, union with God. And his relationship with God was personal and loving. If you take 2 steps toward God, he used to tell me, God runs to you. He was a very plain-featured man, with nothing in his looks or in his dress that made memory cry, hark. I'm not surprised I didn't see him the first time we met. Even when I knew him very well, encounter after encounter, I had difficulty recognizing him. His name was Satish Kumar. These are common names in Tamil Nadu, so the coincidence is not so remarkable. Still, it pleased me that this pious baker, as plain as a shadow and of solid health, and the communist biology teacher and science devotee, the walking mountain on stilts, sadly afflicted with polio in his childhood, carried the same name. Mr. and Mr. Kumar taught me biology and Islam. Mr. and Mr. Kumar led me to study zoology and religious studies at the University of Toronto. Mr. and Mr. Kumar were the prophets of my Indian youth. We prayed together and we practiced Dikar, the recitation of the 99 revealed names of God. He was a Hafiz, one who knows the Quran by heart, and he sang it in a low, slow, simple chant. My Arabic was never very good, but I loved its sound. The guttural eruptions and long flowing vowels rolled just beneath my comprehension like a beautiful brook. I gazed into this brook for long spells of time. It was not wide, just one man's voice, but it was as deep as the universe. I described Mr. Kumar's place as a hovel, yet no mosque, church, or temple ever felt so sacred to me. I sometimes came out of that bakery feeling heavy with glory. I would climb onto my bicycle and pedal that glory through the air. One such time I left town and on my way back, at a point where the land was high and I could see the sea to my left and down the road a long ways, I suddenly felt I was in heaven. The spot was, in fact, no different from when I had passed it long before, but my way of seeing it had changed. The feeling, a paradoxical mix of pulsing energy and profound peace, was intense and blissful. Whereas before the road, the seas, the trees, the air, the sun all spoke differently to me, now they spoke one language of unity. Tree took account of road, which was aware of air, which was mindful of sea, which shared things with sun. Every element lived in harmonious relationship with its nature, its neighbor, and all was kith and kin. I knelt a mortal. I rose immortal. I felt like the center of a small circle, coinciding with the center of a much larger one. Atman met Allah. One other time I felt God come so close to me. It was in Canada, much later. I was visiting friends in the country. It was winter. I was out alone on a walk on their large property and returning to the house. It was a clear, sunny day after a night of snowfall. All nature was blanketed in white. As I was coming up to the road, I turned my head. There was a wood, and in that wood, a small clearing. A breeze, or perhaps it was just an animal, had shaken a branch. Fine snow was falling through the air, glittering in the sunlight. In that falling golden dust, in that sun-splashed clearing, I saw the Virgin Mary. Why her? I don't know. My devotion to Mary was secondary, but it was her. Her skin was pale. She was wearing a white dress and a blue cloak. I remember being struck by her pleats and folds. When I say I saw her, a vision beyond vision, I felt her. I don't quite mean it literally, though she did have body and color. I felt I saw her. A vision beyond vision. I stopped and squinted. She looked beautiful and supremely regal. She was smiling at me with loving kindness. After some seconds, she left me. My heart beat with fear and joy. The presence of God is the finest of rewards. Chapter 21. I am sitting in a downtown cafe after thinking. I have just spent most of an afternoon with him. Our encounters always leave me weary of the glum contentment that characterizes my life. What were those words he used that struck me? Ah, yes. Dry, yeastless factuality. The better story. I take pen and paper out and write. Words of divine consciousness, moral exaltation, lasting feelings of elevation, elation, joy, a quickening of the moral sense, which strikes one as more important than an intellectual understanding of things, an alignment of the universe along moral lines, not intellectual ones, a realization that the founding principle of existence is what we call love, which works itself out sometimes not clearly, not cleanly, not immediately, nonetheless, ineluctably. I pause. What of God's silence? I think it over. I add. An intellect confounded, yet a trusting sense of presence and of ultimate purpose. Chapter 22. I can well imagine an atheist's last words. White, love, my God. And the deathbed leap of faith. Whereas the agnostic, if he stays true to his reasonable self, if he stays beholden to dry, yeastless factuality, might try to explain the warm light bathing him by saying, possibly a failing oxygenation of the brain, and to the very end, lack imagination and miss the better story.